Hi, welcome to the last segment of our video. We're going to talk about nutrients and we're going to talk about foods and what we should be eating to maintain a healthy immune system. To begin with, I'm going to break down the macronutrients. We're going to look at carbohydrates, we're going to look at fats, and we're going to look at proteins. Now just remember, this is an overview. This is just touching the tip of the iceberg, and I hope to present more material as the summer progresses. So let's start by looking at carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are so misunderstood. People think that they're bad, but carbohydrates are vital for our life because what carbohydrates do, they break into the sugar glucose, and glucose is the only energy form that our brain will accept, and our central nervous systems, and our blood cells. So carbohydrates, they create the fuel that energizes our body. We could not live without carbohydrates. But when I start a conversation with carbohydrates, I feel it's always necessary to break carbohydrates into two categories: processed carbohydrates and whole food carbohydrates. Now the difference would be if you get an apple, beautiful apple, encased in all that nice fiber, has all that water inside of it and vitamins. You're getting fiber, vitamins, the minerals and the water, and you're getting carbohydrate. But you're getting a healthy carbohydrate. It's not going to spike your blood sugar if you happen to have a blood sugar disorder. It is safe. It has fructose sugar, the kind of sugar we were designed to eat. Now, if you get that apple and you cut it in half, now you have two apple halves. Well, that is the beginning of the process, because things are going to happen now. The oxidation process is going to start breaking down that apple. You know, within 10-15 minutes, the surface of the open apple are going to appear to be browning, and that's natural. And the reason that happens is you're holding food that still has living enzymes in it. And those enzymes are reacting to the oxygen, and the exposure to the oxygen starts that oxidation process. That's very interesting. So then you get those two apple halves and you cut them in half. And then you decide, I'm going to make an applesauce. So you break them up, maybe put them in the blender, and then you start further processing. So you went from a whole apple to half apples to now you got what is basically going to be applesauce. And then you take the applesauce, you taste it and say, it's not as sweet as I'm used to with my applesauce. I'm going to add some more sugar, and I'm going to add white table sugar. And then you might add other things to enhance its flavor and all that. And that's what the processing of carbohydrates is all about. You go from something that is a whole food into something that's hardly recognized. You see it everywhere. Okay, now grains. Grains are carbohydrates, and you see it with food cereals. You take a grain, the whole grain, you start processing it, and before you know it, you just have garbage. So most of the dry cereal that we eat in this country breaks down into sugar very quickly and spikes the blood sugar because it's very processed. You know, you start off with a whole grain, like an oat for a Cheerio. Before you know it, you have a Cheerio, and in between, a lot of processing takes place. And in the course of that processing with the grain, a lot of the vitamins are lost. And then they have to fortify those cereals with the vitamins that were lost, and they use synthetic vitamins. So in the process, not only do you lose that whole food, the whole grain, and get your oat for the Cheerio, you're going to lose all those natural vitamins, and then those natural vitamins are going to be replaced with synthetic vitamins. So that's what the process is. Whole foods, on the other hand, are whole. You just leave them the way they are. You know, you get a potato, you cut it in half, you bake it. That's a whole food. You're not doing a whole lot to process it. Now, if you start going a little further with that potato, then you can start the process. If you mash those potatoes, well, then you started the process, because you're going to have to add milk. It's going to add some sugar to it. You're going to add other seasonings and all that. And then, you know, if you're at the retail level dealing with these foods, well, those foods have to be preserved, and then a lot of garbage starts getting added into the process to give foods a shelf life and blah, 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 blah. So with carbohydrates, you have a choice. Natural, whole food carbohydrates, the way our body was designed to take those carbohydrates and convert that into glucose that fuels our brains, central nervous system, and blood cells. Or you get the processed carbohydrate that turns into sugar almost instantly and adds to weight gain, that adds to inflammation, that adds to the metabolic syndrome. So that's what carbohydrates are in a nutshell. We need them, we can't live without them. You don't ever want to get into a situation where you're starving yourself from from carbohydrate, and then we start stealing from our protein, because protein can be converted into glucose as a last resort before starvation takes place and we die. But we never want to get to that place, because that's just a secondary mechanism for survival. Now let's talk about fats. Monounsaturated fat, polyunsaturated fat, saturated fat, trans fats, and then that category of omega-3s, 6s, and 9s. Let me start by saying fat is good for you. If you choose the right fat, the healthy fats, the benefits are enormous. Fat insulates our body, regulates our temperature, protects our organs from getting banged around. Fat controls inflammation. Fat is also a fuel for the brain. Our brain is made up of a lot of fat and different fats. But these fats are all valuable. There's no such thing as a good fat and a bad fat when it comes to nutrients. It's the portions and the combinations in which you use that fat. For example, saturated fat comes from animals. That's the fat we get when we eat steak, when we eat the dark meat on chicken and all that. Well, that fat is good for you. It's been blamed for years that if you eat too much saturated fat, you could develop heart disease. But really, fat is used throughout our body. The cells of our body rely on it, and our brain does. Now, saturated fat is not bad within itself, like I said, but we don't want to do too much of it, because I think that the foods that we use to get saturated fat, I think we eat too much of that type of food. For example, meat. I think that we just eat too much meat in this country. We're so reliant on meat. You know, we have this whole issue with our livestock and climate change, and all of those things are related, you know, because we're all part of an ecosystem. But I just think that too much saturated fat in the form of meat can be harmful to you. It's harder to digest, and it could lead to the clogging of arteries. You know, it just depends on the individual. But the good fats control inflammation and do all those good things for you and feed your brain. So the monounsaturated, polyunsaturated are going to be the fats that you get out of plant-based foods. Avocados, okay, olives. You know, those are two examples of plant-based food that are really high in monounsaturated fat that promotes anti-inflammation. Good source, cold water fish, you know, and not only do you get a good source of the monounsaturated fat, you also get omega-3, an essential fatty acid that we need in our body to control inflammation. Because there are three types of essential fatty acids: omega-3s, 6s, and 9s. And we mostly talk about omega-3s and 6s because omega-3 is anti-inflammatory, omega-6 is pro-inflammatory. Now we need both of those in our bodies, because when we injure ourselves, we need inflammation to take place in that point of the injury to help protect it. It gets tender, blah, blah, blah. But we don't need a constant source of pro-inflammation foods. So omega-3s are why we can control that inflammation in our body these days. because a lot of our natural food sources that used to provide omega-3 into the human diet no longer can do that. For example, we used to get a lot of omega-3 from beef a couple of hundred years ago, but that's because the cattle were eating grass and insects and the foods that were natural to them. Well, now we're eating livestock that is eating corn and soy with our carbohydrates, a lot of sugar, and that's kind of destroyed that animal's ability to manufacture omega-3. So back to fats, I want to mention fake fats. Be careful, trans fats. Trans fats made during World War I, I believe, to help preserve the food for our GIs overseas. It had this great ability to keep things from going rancid, fats from going rancid, because fat will go rancid. Well, the problem is now we've found out, since World War I, when this was created, now we have found out that trans fats are deadly, that they don't metabolize in our bodies the way that real fat does. And we find hydrogenated fats, trans fats, in all of the cheap pastries at the grocery store, pastries that we all buy, cookies, Long Johns, what else we have trans fats? Some breads. I always think about the Twinkie. I saw something where if you unwrap a Twinkie and you left it at normal room temperature exposed, it's going to look the same year after year. It's not going to break down. And it's full of hydrogenated fat, trans fat, to preserve it. And imagine if it's not going to break down in a Twinkie, it's not going to break down in the human body, and the residual effect is going to be quite harmful with clogged arteries and maybe cancers and things like that. But fat is good. It's the good fat. And now let's look at protein. Protein is the most abundant macronutrient in our diet. We get it from every food we eat. And let me explain that. Because there are complete proteins that have all the amino acids, and then there are proteins that only have partial amino acids. So let me back up a little bit. Okay, proteins are made up of amino acids. Amino acids are like the ingredients to a recipe, and all the proteins in our body have a recipe. When your body's building a nerve cell, there's a recipe for that, and it's going to require specific amino acids. When your body is trying to repair bone, there's a recipe for that, with the ingredients being amino acids. So that's what proteins are. We get them in everything we eat, and because everything we eat has amino acids, that allows individuals who choose to be vegan or vegetarian to get enough protein in their diet, because they're eating a wide array of vegetables and fruits, and in those vegetables and fruits, the amino acids complete the proteins. So that's what allows that to happen. Because think about it, if a person was just a vegan, not eating any kind of meat, not drinking any kind of milk or eating any dairy product and all that, just pure carbohydrate from plant-based foods, well, they might start lacking in the protein department. But protein deficiency, especially in the Western industrialized countries, is not very common. It could happen. I think we have pockets of civilization where people are so malnourished that they might be very low in their protein. But protein's abundant. Even if you're eating junk food every day, if you eat all your meals out of the 7-Eleven, you're still going to get plenty of protein. But you can get plenty of other bad things and not enough of certain good things. Protein's main function, again, if you just wanted to simplify it, repair and build. So anything our body needs, proteins are going to build it. Anything we do to our body in the form of injury, it's going to repair those injuries. So those are the three macronutrients, and it's good to have a little background on what they are, so you can use tools like the federal government's My Plate, and it makes sense. You can look at a plate and you can make your own version of my plate if it doesn't align with what the federal government wants you to put on your plate. So now we're going to go to the next part of this last piece of the video, and I'm going to use my plate to try to illustrate my point. I'll see you there in just a couple of seconds. Take care. Hi, welcome to the final piece of our video where we're going to talk about food, the nutrients that we should be eating to maintain healthy bodies and maintain a healthy immune system. I thought I would use my plate to help illustrate this and show you the food groups that we should be eating and the nutrients behind those food groups. You see two plates up here. This is the federal government's version of my plate. This is my version of my plate. The federal government's interpretation of my plate looks a little different than my plate. It has 4 quadrants: veggies, meat, protein, grains, fruit, and whole dairy. Well, the problem with this is too much saturated fat in the meat, protein, and the whole dairy, too much carbohydrates. You get carbohydrates with veggies, carbohydrates with fruits, carbohydrates with grains, and carbohydrates with dairy. That's a lot of sugar on that plate. It doesn't look like sugar when you just look at it at the surface level, but carbohydrates do break into sugar that become glucose that feed our bodies. We need it. We just need the right kind, and we don't need too much. We should really have more protein and fat than carbohydrates in our diet. So if you look at my plate, you see it looks a little different. 3/4 of the plate is plant-based food, a small section for fruit, grains, and meat proteins, with room for dairy, but this dairy is low fat, 1 or 2%. You see the difference? You're not going to have as much carbohydrate. You have carbs here, but it's the safe, high quality carbohydrates that you need coming from plant-based food. Fruit, fructose is the sugar there. You're not getting as much. You have a smaller portion. Grains, if you want to include grains, if you can tolerate them, you can see with my version of my plate, it's a much smaller piece of the plate. And then the meat protein is a smaller portion as well. That's not going to give you as much saturated fat. So if you look at my plate, yeah, you're going to get carbohydrates there, but they're the healthy whole food carbohydrates that don't have any detrimental effect on your body. And then fruit, we need fruit. Fruit is just as valuable to us as veggies, but fruit has a little more sugar. Fructose is the sugar that you find in fruit, and then, grains and meat proteins. So you see the difference. The federal government's interpretation, my interpretation. I really believe that my plate is much healthier than this version, and it's based on a lot of experience working with people that are trying to get healthy. I work in my special practice with a lot of people with type 2 diabetes, and they are always looking for ways to eat good carbohydrates and eliminate those processed foods. So as I leave you today, just remember you learned the what about the immune system, what it does, how it does it. You learned some tips from the Harvard School of Medicine on what you can do to have a common sense approach to your immune system. You get a lot of rest, you exercise, you watch your weight, you stay away from smoking and drinking, and you try to de-stress. So I will stick around and answer your questions. I hope you have a lot of questions about the food part of this video, because this is just an overview, this is just a guideline, and we're all individuals with our own individual biology. So I'll be talking to you very soon. Thank you.